I first want to remind you of next week's lecture by Calvin Hamilton. We didn't publicize this in the announcement because we wanted Mr. Hamilton to speak as lecturer at UCLA, but I can let this loyal group into the secret that he's also city planner, as I'm sure most of you know. But it's our hope that he will give a forward-looking lecture apart from his position as city planner in his lecture on population, land use, and the future of Los Angeles. It's a pleasure to introduce Professor Arthur F. Pillsbury, who is Professor of Engineering and head of the Environmental Systems and Resources Division in the Department of Engineering. Professor Pillsbury was for a number of years in the College of Agriculture at UCLA and served for 6-7 years as chairman until agriculture was phased out at UCLA, and as Professor Pillsbury puts it, he phased out of agriculture and into engineering, where he continues his interest in water problems as the acting director of the Water Resources Center. He's served as a consultant for the World Bank, the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs. He was involved in this situation regarding the lower Colorado River and salinity problems, which involve the United States and Mexico, was on the International Boundary and Water Commission for that problem. He's now a consultant for the Federal Water Pollution Control Administration as a member of the National Technical Advisory Committee on Water Quality Criteria for Agriculture. His current research is mostly connected with the Water Resources Center, where his main interest is the quality of water for agricultural uses. Water has certainly been one of the natural resources that has been most planned for and in the history of Los Angeles, but it's clear that just judging from some of the construction one sees as one drives north, that there is a lot of concern about this matter yet, and water is connected with the destiny of Los Angeles. Professor Pillsbury speaking on water and the destiny of Los Angeles.
Thank you, Dr. Hockey. Ladies and gentlemen, sometimes we hear scare headlines about crises. Maybe it's because we have had such very forward and progressive leadership in the water industry in Los Angeles that there certainly is no crisis today. Los Angeles is very well off as regards water. Now, I wanted to show a few slides, and I like to talk from notes. So I hope you don't object the liberty I took. I'm going to use some little glass slides. This is one on which I scribbled my notes from which to read. So I'm afraid you're going to have to view the notes. And we'll just start right in with the first slide. As to the need for water, if you think of water on a basis of area, the area of land involved, the figures are not so widely different, no matter where you are, in the quite far north or down in the tropics. It's usually somewhere in the range of 1.5 to 7 feet depth of water over that land in a year. Now in Los Angeles, it's about 2.5 feet depth per year. As you go inland, well, let's go to Imperial Valley, it's around 5 feet depth per year, and that's regardless of whether you're talking about municipal and industrial water, or whether you're talking about agricultural water, water for irrigation. If you have an intensive development, you use about the same amount of water regardless. And of course you use more in summer than you do in winter. And the thing would be reversed, of course, for the southern hemisphere, where their summers are in December and January. But it's something like that, the use of water. For Los Angeles, about 2.5 inches, about half of an inch of its rainfall can be said to be effective, and it all comes in the winter, and that's during a period of low demand. So the net need of Los Angeles as a city is about 2 feet depth per year. Next slide, please. We can't talk about quality of water unless we talk a little about the hazards of water. Because floods affect the quality of water. Watersheds produce sediments as well as water. It has been said that the mountains are always wearing down and the valleys are filling up. It's a geologic process that goes on and on. Indeed, water is the agent which makes much of this possible. Water acts as a lubricant to make some of the steep hillside slopes unstable. It is the eroder of water on the surface and carries sediment into the streams and down into the valleys. And most of that carrying is done during major floods. If you're thinking about the flood that comes once every 50 years, once every 100 years, or once every 1,000 years, by far the bulk of the sediments are carried during those major floods. As they wear down the mountains, they fill up the valleys. And a good part of Los Angeles and Southern California is built on floodplains, where the rivers overtop their banks and deposit a thin layer, often a thin layer, of sediments over the surface. Within the framework of the social constraints that we've had agencies that have done an excellent job in trying to decrease the risk involved in floods. And they've been able to design to protect life and property pretty much from the flood that will get once in 50 years. They can do nothing for the floods that come at less frequent intervals. Next slide, please. Now I want to bring in another concept, that cities tend to grow where there are two things in particular. One is where there's a natural transportation hub. And Los Angeles fulfills that role. It fulfilled it in the early days when El Camino Real was in the path of El Camino Real. And all the passes and all the routes tended to converge, even from the harbor at San Pedro and what was it for a short while, a harbor at Santa Monica, converged at Los Angeles. And the second essential thing for a city to be is a ready water supply. Next slide, please. The Pueblo of Los Angeles was chartered by King Carlos III in 1781. And he specified that the town, the Pueblo, was to occupy the uplands above the mother ditch. The mother ditch was the water supply. Now, you might wonder why the Los Angeles could be considered a dependable water supply. This is a profile, very rough, up the San Fernando Valley. There is a water table there. Right now, that water table is depressed because water is being pumped. But back in those days, there were no pumps and no that would significantly affect the water table. And at this lower end, there was perennial flow. If you go through Santa Ana Gorge on the Santa Ana River, you'll still see perennial flow there under a similar situation. Next slide, please. This is an old photograph of the old water wheel that lifted water from the Los Angeles River up to this flume from whence it flowed into the mother ditch. Next slide, please. And here is an old map of the Pueblo, and you see the mother ditch, the main ditch right through there. That was the water supply for the Pueblo. And it was a water supply until about 1904 or 1905. You'll notice that the agricultural lands were largely restricted to the floodplains below the mother ditch and to the Los Angeles River. Next slide, please. As I said, we had forward-looking people, and probably William Mulholland was the most forward pioneer in the development of water for the city of Los Angeles. And the Department of Water and Power secretly started purchasing land in the Owens Valley in 1905. The idea being that you purchase the land, you get the water right with the land. When you own all the land, you own all the water right, and then we can transport it. He had good intentions, but of course a lot of trouble developed later. In 1907, the city voted bonds to go ahead with the project. And William Mulholland's reputed to have said, if you don't build it, you'll never need it. In other words, if you don't have a good water supply, you're never going to be a big city. There have been charges, many, and they continue today, that Los Angeles has overbuilt its water supply. Certainly, if you consider Los Angeles an entity surrounded by walls and nothing going on outside, it has greatly overbuilt. A part of that is due to the vagaries of climate. A lot of people, natives, have gone through long periods when there's little, if any, rainfall, have been pretty concerned of what would happen if Los Angeles went without water. And it's because of that semi-arid nature of the climate that I think many people have tended to be so forward-looking in developing water supply. Next slide, please. The development of the Owens Valley project brought into being another concept which has stood with us to today, until today, and that is the two-price system. You have one price for water for domestic industrial uses. You have one price for irrigation. Agriculture cannot afford to pay what domestic consumers and industry can afford to pay. Now, you might say that the urban community is subsidizing agriculture. That's not true at all. There are several things to keep track of, keep in your mind. One is the economy of size. Say if you have a small project you can build for $5 million, you very often can redesign that project and find you can double the capacity of the project for $6 or $7 million. Therefore, for a small increase, you can get a lot more water. And you can afford to sell water for irrigation at a lot lower rate and still get by with cheaper water for urban purposes with that two-price system. And then it's a question of rate of demand buildup. And you notice for urban purposes, populations grow relatively slowly. Population has been exploding in Los Angeles, but it's nothing to the rate at which agriculture can develop and utilize water at about the same rate. The main big area that had been wheat fields and was incorporated into the city of Los Angeles so it could be served with water was, of course, the San Fernando Valley. And it was the irrigation of the San Fernando Valley that made it possible to develop the Owens Valley project. Now we can look back and we see that the urban population have essentially displaced agriculture, but they're using about the same amount of water. Next slide, please. Another concept we must bring in is that according to usual law, water is appurtenant to the land. It means if you own the land, you own whatever water right that goes with it. Now let's assume that this is the edge of the boundary of the city of Los Angeles. And Los Angeles certainly does have plenty of water rights. Here are two pieces of property. Neither one utilizes water. But this property here has the right to water service. Anytime it wants to, it can start using. And there's a very good reason for that. This land has been paying taxes for a long period of years. The cost of developing that water right, the cost of planning the project rather, the cost of designing and developing the project, and it has borne that cost. And that cost should be reflected in the value of the land. Too often, people buying land do not recognize that difference, but it's very real. This land here should have very low value for sale because it does not have the water right that this land has, although it might be equivalent in every other respect. In this climate where you have no rainfall in the summer, the land is essentially valueless without a water right. There's been a lot of discussion about value of water versus price. We usually pay for part of our water in taxes, and when we take water, we pay for what's delivered as a toll. That is the equitable way of doing it because this represents the fixed charges, the investment that's in the land. This represents the cost, maintenance and operation mainly, of utilizing the water. So, and maybe the value of the water is not reflected at all in the price you pay. Next slide, please. Now, after the Owens Valley project was completed, Los Angeles started expanding. It expanded a lot before with the acquisition of San Fernando Valley, but towns, peripheral towns, began running out of water, and as a means of getting water, they in effect bought into Los Angeles. They became incorporated. The little town of Hollywood, which was, when I was a child, was a long ways from downtown Los Angeles in a sleepy little community. That's one of the towns that bought its way in. Venice is another example. So the area of Los Angeles started expanding. And before they ran out of water, they began thinking about expanding the Owens Valley project, going up into the Mono Basin, and that project was completed in 1940. Right now they have found that by pumping water from the groundwater supply of the Owens Valley, they can increase the yield from the Owens Mono Valleys, Owens Valley and the Mono Basin, and so they're putting in the second barrel, and that is scheduled to be completed in 1969. As I said, there's been a lot of disagreement about the way Los Angeles went at acquiring the water rights of the Owens Valley. That is a high elevation valley. It has a short growing season. For agriculture, and it was rather isolated, and for agriculture it was rather unimportant and would have to remain rather unimportant for many, many years to come. As it is now, you can say that the city of Los Angeles has caused the environment of that region to be optimized, because by preserving the area as a watershed, it has developed it into a recreational area that is second to none. It is a delightful area. It still retains many of the primitive aspects that we like in our recreation of that type. And I think that the valley is better off today than it would be if agriculture had continued. Next slide, please. Just a little slide to show from the Department of Water and Power, showing this is the Mono Lake and the other lakes up there, which are very nice recreational lakes, Mammoth Lakes, June Lake, and so forth. Part of the system, they generate power as the water drops. It comes out of the east side of the Sierras, and they generate power all the way along, and it's distributed through Los Angeles. Next slide, please. To illustrate, this is Convict Lake in the near the crest of the Sierras. So water comes from the high mountains. Next slide, please. The aqueduct in the upper reaches just above Haywee Reservoir. You see its unlined section there. Next slide, please. Farther down in the lined section. Next slide, please. Jawbone siphon. It comes out of tunnel section there, and in order not to lose the head, to retain it to get the water here and to generate power with it, why it's in a pressure pipe. The second barrel will add 2 barrels here. The tunnels and similar structures are of adequate size. Next slide, please. I think you've all seen these cascades just north of the Van Norman Lakes as you go out San Diego Freeway north. These cascades have water in them when the hydro plants are not operating. If the hydro plants are operating, of course the water is going through the penstock to the hydro plant. Next slide, please. And of course you have to have regulation of the supply in the city, and this is Eagle Rock Reservoir. Next slide, please. Now we come to the Metropolitan Water District, which is another creature of the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. It was William Mulholland that first sent crews out to explore for possible routes of an aqueduct from the Colorado River. And that was in 1923. In 1925, the city of Los Angeles voted a $2 million bond issue for planning of this project. It was, of course, far bigger than the city of Los Angeles could justify itself. And Los Angeles was not the part of Southern California running out of water. There were parts that were very low on water, even some of the cities close at hand, like Beverly Hills, Santa Monica, Burbank, Glendale. And so the upshot of it was that the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California was formed in 1928, and bonds were authorized. We voted on them, and construction started in 1931 and was completed in 1941. The aqueduct was complete. It has since been enlarged, and now the common slogan is 1 billion gallons a day, because that's about what the aqueduct brings to Southern California. It started out, the city of Los Angeles itself was half owner of the Metropolitan Water District. I don't think most of you know that, but present time it's about 42% owner, and as other areas buy in, it'll be eventually down to about 1/3 ownership. Next slide, please. That's just a little map of the system. Of course, Hoover Dam is an integral part of it. You had to have regulation of the river and storage of the floodwaters for periods of low flow. So Parker Dam was built by the Bureau of Reclamation to be paid for in total with interest by the power companies and the Department of Water Power, the City of Los Angeles, in Southern California. In other words, Southern California is paying for Hoover Dam with interest. And all the regulation is obtained at that point. Then it is diverted at Parker Dam, just above Parker Dam, and 5 pump lift, one right at Parker Dam, at the edge of the lake, Jean pump lift, Iron Mountain, Eagle Mountain, Lake, and I don't see, there's another one in there, Hayfield is in there. But it's in partly tunnel, partly canal, partly pipeline to Lake Matthews. Next slide, please. Just show you the various districts, even down to the boundary, international boundary. This is San Diego, that are now in the metropolitan district. The only thing really lacking of great importance is the San Bernardino area. That is not in the district. The people, for some reason or other, I don't know the political situation, they've always refused to go along. They've had a lot of water problems. They do have a contract with the state for the new project, and so they will be taken care of in that way. This is the Camp Pendleton area, former Rancho Margarita, and so it depends on the Santa Margarita for water, the river. Next slide, please. Just a few slides. Hoover Dam, of course, the power generation to pay for it, the storage, and flood regulation it provides. Next slide, please. Parker Dam, the pumping plant is around the corner back in there. They also generate a bit of power there to help run these pumps up here. Next slide, please. The pumps from Lake Havasu up till it goes into the tunnel section there and through this immediate mountains. Next slide, please. And just to show you some of the canal section, next slide, please. All line canal, and the last pumping lift, Hayfield, and from this point here, it flows by gravity to Lake Matthews. Next slide, please. And a view of Lake Matthews, the control tower and the outlet works. Next slide, please. Los Angeles, the Colorado River water, rather, is rather salty. It has a lot of luxuriant algae growth and other growth in it. And to make it usable, they do filter it and soften it. They don't soften it all the way. There are a lot of problems we'll get into in a few minutes about that. But this is the Weymouth filtering and softening plant near San Dimas. Next slide, please. Now we go into the California Water Plan, which is the brainchild of the California Department of Water Resources. I think you all remember that bonds were floated in 1960. There's a lot of controversy then, but the bonds passed overwhelmingly. We're supposed to get our first water in 1971, and are certainly proceeding on schedule. Next slide, please. This isn't a very good slide, but it's all I could find. But the Feather River is up here. It runs into the Sacramento. The Sacramento flows down here and out the delta here into San Francisco Bay. Now, the delta is where the last water hole on the San Joaquin River and the Sacramento River, and it contains such pollution as exists from the developments of these two valleys. But it's not very serious, and there will be problems. For instance, the state has deferred the peripheral canal and the delta, which will give problems. they've deferred the master drain up the valley, which will create problems. But the water comes down the west side, will be used at a cheaper rate for irrigation down here in this west side, and then pumped over the Tehachapies. Next slide, please. This is the Oroville Dam on the Feather River under construction. It's an earth-fill dam, earth and rock fill, I should say, and they use a lot of the old gold dredger tailings for the construction. Next slide, please. Immediately below that, we have a small dam, Thermalito, and that's where the discharge that's required will be generated, will be released. I might say that the Feather River has long had all its water rights for normal flows appropriated. There is none available. This storage contemplates holding back the peaks of the floods, basically. And those flood peaks are what will be transported to Southern California. Not that water, but exchange water. That water just goes into the common pool, arrives down the delta and all mixed up. But the significance of Thermalito is that in order to get a better price for power, they have a system developed for the power turbines reversing and working as pumps to pump water back up into the reservoir, the big reservoir, during off-peak hours. And then when they have the peak electric demand, why more is run down, they generate power. And that pump storage concept is being used throughout the California Water Plan. Next slide, please. This is a canal that's been built up to the delta, the Tracy pumping plant, and then the discharge pipes up to the canal, which you see starting under construction there. Next slide, please. And then this is San Luis Dam. They pump water into it from this pumping plant here. They will pump water into it for storage. And this same pump storage concept is used here. So this will be operated particularly during peak hours as a generator and off-peak hours as a pump. Next slide, please. Just the radio gates to control of flow. Next slide, please, into San Luis Reservoir. And you're going up the valley instead of down the valley, so periodically you have to have pumping plants to boost it a ways. This is Dos Amigos pumping plant below San Luis, and the California Aqueduct heading towards Southern California. Next slide, please. And the Carly Porter Tunnel through the Tehachapies is now under construction. Next slide, please. This shows the East Branch. That which you see in green will be built by the state, or is being built by the state, and will end at a reservoir near Paris, between Paris, the town of Paris, and the town of Hemet. And this is the West Branch, and where it turns red, this is what the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California will build. Next slide, please. Another view. What is in blue is already built. These things, this is what the state's building. This is what the Metropolitan Water District is building to connect in. Now, down here, I guess that's an older picture. It doesn't show it too well, but right in here there is an island contemplated where they'll have nuclear power generation, and the waste heat from that nuclear power will create a desalting plant. We'll get distilled water, and that will be pumped up here to the Demer softening and filtration plant to dilute the rather salty Colorado River water at that point. Next slide, please. Now, what is the LA City supply year? The net that has to be provided, half a foot, I said, was effective rainfall. We need about 2 feet. From local sources, they get about 5.5 inches depth per year. From the Owens Mono project, about 14.7. From the Metropolitan Water District, about 3.8, which makes the 2 feet. So you can see, from the basis of ownership, the city of Los Angeles has lots of water. But the rest of Southern California is not as well off. Next slide, please. It's sort of as if the city of Los Angeles was kind of the mother to a brood of satellites around. And I think there's a lot of justification for that. Again, you can't treat Los Angeles with an entity with an iron wall around it. There is trade, there is transportation, there is back and forth. Each benefits by the other. And I think more and more that is the basic philosophy that underlies it. You remember back in 1944, the treaty with Mexico, and everybody raised such a howl about giving water away? Actually, Mexico had established a right to about half of the 1.5 million acre feet that she was granted under the treaty. And everybody knew that there would be return water, wastewater, from projects along the Colorado in Los Angeles equal to about that amount. So it is only reasonable. That was a reasonable figure. And Mexico is still way short of water. If you have this philosophy that if Mexico is adversely affected, you're adversely affected too, I think you can be far more liberal than otherwise. And then the Supreme Court decision, the case of Arizona versus California, there's a lot of effort put into the case. It's more or less a dispute over the appropriation doctrine and the riparian doctrine. The appropriation doctrine tends to be supreme in California, and that is the doctrine that first come, first serve. That who puts the water to beneficial use first has the first right to that water, and others are all secondary. The riparian doctrine says that time is not of the essence. If the river goes by your property as it goes by Arizona, then Arizona has certain inherent rights that time does not take away. So it was basically on that concept that the Supreme Court awarded the decision to Arizona. And after the decision was made, I think the people of Los Angeles recognized that if Arizona suffered, Los Angeles would suffer. And certainly Arizona is far more desperate for water than Los Angeles is. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to kind of summarize the coastal quantities of water. By coastal of Southern California, I mean from the crest of the mountains to the ocean. Beyond the crest, you have the Mojave Desert, the high elevation desert, and the water all goes into sinks there where it's evaporated. In the Colorado Desert, the low elevation desert, you have one sink, Salton Sea, which is below sea level, and you have the Gulf of California. So we'll disregard this. We'll think about Southern California, this coastal part. Next slide, please. The Department of Water Resources, State of California, a good many years ago, not in the 40s, made quite a detailed study of the land in Southern California that was susceptible to intense utilization. And they came to the conclusion there are about, and this is coastal, they came to the conclusion that about 4,250 square miles And because it's a little more inland than the city of Los Angeles, it would have to be, for intense development, have to be about 27 inches depth per year. Now I'm just going to throw in some metric system stuff. Someday we're going to have to go to the metric systems, getting so that the United States is isolated. Everybody else is going to it. Great Britain is going to it. And the United States is the only entity which is not, as yet. But professional organizations are taking steps. For instance, American Society of Testing Materials, that's responsible for all the specifications and all types of construction and everything else. They're going to put in duplicate metric and English tables. Another thing is that the so-called English system we use isn't. Their imperial gallon is quite different than our U.S. gallon, for instance. But I'm going to use the term right here, cubic kilometers, because it's an awful big volume. In part, the cubic kilometers about 6/10 of a mile long. You think of a cube that long, 6/10 of a mile high, and 6/10 of a mile wide. That is a cubic kilometer. If you're familiar with acre feet, there are 810,000 acre feet in a cubic kilometer. Next slide, please. This gives nice little figures that are easy to show. Our local supply for this coastal Southern California, the local supply is 1.2 cubic kilometers per year. The Owens Mono project, as it will be with the second barrel in 1969, is 0.6. The Colorado River entitlement is 1.5. Now I say entitlement because in accordance with the Supreme Court decision, we might not get all of that. It may be that the aqueduct will be partly dry or dry part of the time. We don't know. There is a possibility that the flow of the Colorado will be amplified. There is this NWAPA concept, the North American Water and Power Alliance, it is called. It's been developed by the Parsons Company here in Los Angeles, where they would develop stupendous quantities of water. The whole thing eventually would cost about $100 billion, but all the West would have adequate water. Now, we are on the coast, and I think you'll see as we go along that where you're on the coast, you have an immense reservoir, the ocean. And you can desalt that water and dispose of your brine resulting from the desalting process quite easily. But the interior has no possibility of vast desalting works. They just do not have a supply. And if we're thinking of that concept of Los Angeles, the mother and her brood, if we apply that farther away, the entire West would benefit by a concept such as NWAPA, where Arizona would not get 1.5 million acre feet per year, but 6 or 7 million acre feet per year, far more close to what she can justifiably use. So it may well be that the Colorado entitlement will be lower than that. Then the California aqueduct will bring 2.7, and this little MWD pilot distilled water plant, which will be used to dilute a rather salty water, would be actually 0.07, but I didn't want to carry it out any farther, so I called it 0.1. And you see, we're still short of the 7.7 that someday, ultimately, we may need. Next slide, please. Just a sketch that the Metropolitan Water District made of this combination nuclear power generation and water desalting plant. Most people are rather afraid of water desalting works. Of nuclear power generation, because they're afraid of nuclear energy. Actually, there's been a lot of experience with nuclear power generation, and never in the history of power generation has there been a source of power so utterly safe as nuclear power. So it's only a matter of time before we get over our fears of nuclear power, and we won't mind being within a block or two of a nuclear power plant. But this is put out on an island to allay such fears. Next slide, please. You see, according to that, we have at least 1.6 cubic kilometers ultimately short of our ultimate needs. We waste into the Pacific Ocean 1.2 cubic kilometers per year, and eventually we'll be wasting about 2.8. And possibly part of that water can be reclaimed. It's not much of a problem. It can be reclaimed. We have the technology now. Desalting we don't, but we think that we're getting there. And particularly the distillation with the as a byproduct of power generation looks promising for very big plants in the future. For very little plants, some of these membrane techniques are particularly promising. There's electrodialysis, where it's basically electric current, which takes out some of the salts. And then there's a reverse osmosis process, for which UCLA is largely responsible. The concept was developed here, the membrane was developed here, the critical things about it. So that is a newer but particularly promising process for small plants. It's being produced now by R&D outfits as small package units that you can move to wherever you need them. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to talk about water quality management a little bit. I've already mentioned that the watersheds produce sediments, and that's a factor in quality, but it's really not an important factor so far as water quality is concerned, because we are separating. The water is naturally separated. We do not have flowing streams here, flowing streams that could be polluted. And if we did, we would find during flood they carried lots of sediments. But the flow is only during these rare events, and then it spreads over the land under natural conditions, and the sediments are deposited there. And we get our clear ground water from groundwater sources, from wells, and it is under the original system, it was usually of good quality. Now our flood control techniques are, one, detention reservoirs. We try to cut off the peaks of the floods and hold that back until the channels can take the flow. Then we improve the channels. I think Professor Logan mentioned he didn't like to see the paved channels, but under the social constraints where we are intensively occupying the floodplains, I don't think there's any alternative. Because that gets the water out to the ocean just as fast as you can possibly get it out. The channels are straightened, they're steepened, and they're smoothed. Then we have debris basins at the mouth of the canyons, and they are supposed to catch the coarsest material. With the channel improvement, presumably material sand and finer is carried out to the ocean. And that's important because we don't want to lose the sand in our beaches. And we help get away from the deposits on the land. Next slide, please. Now the other aspects of quality, pollution, and I'll define some terms. Pollution is one. Very largely in urban purposes, we use water as a carrier of waste. We wash our clothes, the dirt that is collected in the clothes is flushed away in the sewer. We have garbage disposals that grind up our garbage and send it down the sewer. Water is a cheap commodity. and it's a cheap way to dispose of our waste. And we have an affluent society. I think such disposal can be expected to continue. You cannot expect this society to be frugal in its use of water. Then another term is contamination that is used, and that should refer to the potability of the water. Does it have pathogens, other materials in it, dissolved or suspended, that would render it unsafe? And then the other thing is degradation, and that's the buildup of salts in water. And why do salts build up? Let me have the next slide, please. I'd like to pursue that a little bit. Salt is an essential constituent of all streams. I did this chart simply from taking representative streams in western United States. That happens to be the Columbia River there. The Willamette is one of these. I forget which one. No, that's the Willamette. But you see, there is a trend that way. Some are above and some are below. These are all happen to be from old sedimentary formations. These low ones happen to be pretty much from recent granitic formations, but this is just an approximate thing anyway. To give you the concept that all water has salts. It's the weathering of rock material into soil and erosion of that soil. During that process, the material being degraded gives up salts, and that is the source. Next slide, please. Another aspect of quality I should mention is softening. There are other ions involved, but the calcium and the sodium cations are usually the dominant ones, and they serve to characterize it. This is a bivalent one. We soften the water by substituting sodium for calcium. We change the calcium to sodium. We do that because the bivalent salts are hard on, they give bathtub ring, they're hard on soap, they produce boiler scale and give us lots of trouble. But in agriculture, and for using the water in your garden, you don't want a soft water, you want a hard water. You want a water with a reasonable amount of calcium in it. What's important is the ratio of calcium to magnesium. So you don't want delivered through the mains to your home, you don't want a very soft water, you want a compromise. You might say the inside you want soft water, outside you want hard water. Now this question of softening is only important if the salts are high. If you had a water supply of lower salt content, it would not be important. Next slide, please. Now, what are the salts in our present supply? Owens Valley, very acceptable, 190 parts per million, 190. Now, along the Los Angeles River in the San Fernando Valley, the Department of Water and Power maintains a series of wells which they have to pump regularly, whether they want to or not. In 1942-43, we were at just the tail end of a series of wet years, and they began to have complaints in the San Fernando Valley of crops dying, of water in basements. They had a high water table, particularly along the Los Angeles River. The city of Los Angeles had so much water from the Owens Valley project, they were not pumping their wells. They had to immediately reestablish these wells and start pumping them, and you can see that the water is somewhat saltier than the Owens Valley supply. So the MWD water, 810. You can see it's a lot worse than the Owens Valley water. The California Aqueduct, the state says that they will furnish water of less than 400 parts per million. We don't know exactly what it'll be. Outside of the city of Los Angeles, We have MWD water, and we have local well water, particularly, and a wide range of salt concentrations, and most of it not too good and not too plentiful. The rest of Southern California is pretty close to just enough water. The city of Los Angeles is the one that might be said to have overdeveloped its water supplies. Next slide, please. Now I want to introduce a few more concepts. I've said that water carries salt, and use of that water causes those salts to become concentrated. Watersheds utilize, actually, on the United States as a whole, about 70% of the water that falls on those watersheds. That is growing the vegetation you see on those watersheds. And such as is stored is used pretty thoroughly. Agriculture is another concentrating process. Plants grow by utilizing carbon dioxide, the sun for energy, and water, which is transpired through the leaves. So evapotranspiration, which utilizes about 60 to 80% of water supplied to irrigation, is a very, very great concentrating mechanism. Reservoirs are a concentrating mechanism because of evaporation. Then urban developments, we also have some of this concentration, but we also add salts. Now I want to bring in another concept, and that is salt balance. We bring in an awful lot of salt with our water. Under natural conditions, all that salt is discharged to the ocean, so you maintain a balance. But we have lowered the water levels in our wells, in a sense closed off the natural outlet of those groundwater basins. We're adversely affecting the water that goes into them. The only thing going to the sea is the sewage from the coastal strip. We have a sewer system for the Los Angeles County that's handled by the county sanitation districts. We have the sewage system for the city of Los Angeles, and we have sewage systems for the towns up and down the line on the coast. But all the other water that is not used actually is spread on the land one way or another, sinks down, and is reused and reused. There is no hokum about we should learn to reuse our water here. We can't avoid it. We naturally reuse our water. The groundwater is our rivers. We have no other storage area, source of storage of water. You have to have storage to have the water when you need it. That is adequate in any way except our groundwater. So we have to use groundwater storage capacity to store the water we import into the area. And we have to have some outlet so the salt does not just accumulate there. Next slide, please. Much of our wastewater is really too good to waste. It is not terribly high in salts. I do not think it's necessary to think of pumping it back into the mains and using it as potable water. There are many uses that can be developed to enhance the environment of Southern California. Recreation is something that just hasn't been explored to any depth at all. There's an immense value in utilizing some of this reclaimed sewage as recreational water, as is done in the Santee project on a small scale in San Diego County. It's used for boating, swimming, and fishing. Nobody objects to it. It's perfectly pure. It's not good water. You wouldn't want to drink it. You wouldn't want to use it around the house, but it's satisfactory. And then, too, we have a lot of chaparral vegetation around on our mountains. And we spent millions and millions and millions to stop the burning of the chaparral. Regardless of what we spend, the Santa Ana winds come up during the winter. We have a dry period, extremely windy. A fire gets started and it burns. And it burns generally until the fuel's gone or the weather changes. And that type of vegetation it was developed under conditions where it periodically burned. It has done it for many thousands of years, and there's no reason to anticipate anything different. But if we're going to build urban developments up into it and up against it, we have to develop a buffer zone of green vegetation where fuel is not allowed to accumulate, and that can be done very well with somewhat brackish water that can be obtained from wastewater. So we can combine reservoirs for recreational purposes to store that water until we need it to water this vegetation, and we must have watered vegetation if we're going to have any kind of a fire break. So that is another possibility for utilizing some of our waste. And it's not necessary at all to think of putting it back into the domestic water system. But the important thing is that over a period of time we're going to have to get a balance between the salts brought into the Southern California and the salts taken to the ocean. We must strike a salt balance. And take next slide, please. Now let's look at what desalting is. We might think of it as a black box. We have to put some energy into it, and I've indicate the energy of one form or another is put into it. The reverse osmosis uses pressure as its energy. Electrodialysis is electricity, and of course heat for the distillation processes. And here's our poor quality water coming into it, and what comes out is a good quality water which will be extremely useful in diluting our rather salty waters we have here. The Colorado River water is not a good water. It's all as best we can do. But if we can dilute that, then we'll have good water. But this is something that people have not thought about too much. We are concentrating our waste down to a smaller conduit that we can take to the sea without too much expense. In other words, we can begin to move upstream with our water treatment plants, such as having a big plant right in the ocean at Hyperion. We can begin to move upstream and then have a smaller supply, a smaller waste conduit that takes the salt to the ocean, so we can begin to achieve salt balance. And basically it is this desalting which is in the future for the city of Los Angeles, for all of California, to provide for salt balance, and that is the basic problem rather than quantity of water before us at the present time. I thank you.
Professor Pillsbury will answer questions. I'd like to utilize this position to ask the first question. Since one of our topics is conservation, would you care to comment on the proposed dams on the Colorado River and their practicality?
The Colorado River is fully developed now for its present supply. The only water that has wasted to the Gulf in recent years has been 6,000 parts per million water, which nobody can use, that in the wintertime is wasted from the wells that are pumped for drainage in the Welton Mohawk district. That water is utterly of no use to anybody. In all, except during the winter, it is mixed with Colorado River, and Mexico grudgingly accepts it. But except for that, no water has wasted from the Colorado River in recent years. Hoover Dam is low. Glen Canyon, they would want desperately to fill. They haven't got the water to fill it. They're just about enough for power generation. There's Flaming Gorge, Navajo, and other dams on the river. There are too many dams on the river now. We start at Morelos, and there's 7 dams up to Hoover. Those have caused the water table throughout that whole Colorado River Valley to raise, and the evapotranspiration loss from the worthless vegetation that has created is one of the reasons we have not enough water now. And in my opinion, there should be no further dams on the Colorado River until and if the supply is amplified from some other source.
Questions?
Yes.
I'm just wondering, turning this concept of salt concentration a bit further, is there any thought or possibly any future in evaporating the water completely somehow and getting some economic gain from the salt?
You're getting into something that's way out. The technology advances by steps, and we're beginning to see that a few more steps, this desalting, where you concentrate it down, will do the trick. And I still think that water is the cheapest way to transport this mixture of salts away. The salt is manufactured from seawater, but it is a water that's better designed for the stepwise process than the wastewater would be. I think the cheapest thing's going to be to concentrate the waste and get it to the ocean and not try to take all the water out of it. There's too much energy involved.
Is there any danger to polluting the ocean by this? We hear about pollution in all parts today.
Can you hear the question in back? The question was, is there any danger of polluting the ocean?
There is danger of polluting the shoreline, a narrow strip along the shore, and that is a concern today. It was a concern before Hyperion was redesigned and reconstructed, and there was a period when the beaches out here were closed down. Bathing was prohibited because there was pollution. Now you can't help but change the environment of that coastal strip some way, but I don't think that it's too serious one way or the other. We must make the water, decontaminate the water before it goes to the ocean. Yes.
Are there currently any plans to decontaminate the water before it goes to the ocean? I mean, summertime is almost like swimming in the river. Is there any?
Well, as I said, you have to begin to think of moving your treatment upstream. For instance, there should be treatment plants in the San Fernando Valley. Don't haul it all away. You get into these unstable organic materials we flush down the sewers, use up the oxygen. The water becomes anaerobic, and the farther we take it, the worse it gets. If you move upstream and handle it up there, you can dispose of it and without serious problems. Hyperion's taken quite a ways out into the ocean before it is released. I don't approve of this Hyperion type of operation. I think it should be move upstream. Then you get away from that. Yes.
On the news tonight, there was special commentary on the
We can go just so far in this flood control. In December, most of the flood control reservoirs were filled and then they're released so they'd have storage capacity again for the spring runoff. And you do save some of the water, and of course the big storage reservoirs are deliberately built for that purpose. They're built to store the water. When you get to multi-purpose reservoir, part of the capacity is reserved for flood storage, which is released as soon as it can. But they're just so far that you can go, and undoubtedly there will be problems in the Central Valley this summer as the snows melt, particularly if we have it turns suddenly hot. We're in for some high floods there. Yes?
I understand, Professor, that our dumping of organic sewage into the ocean here has increased sea urchins to such an extent that they have destroyed almost all of our salt pans. This organic material is good soil conditioning and fertilizing material. Will you discuss that, Peter?
Well, if you have a completely anaerobic process like the city of Milwaukee has, and they've been famous for that, a lot of their milorganite fertilizer is used here. You have to have a completely oxidizing process. Here they use the activated sludge, but in the digestion they go to an anaerobic process. After they separate the sludge, then they go to anaerobic. And if you avoid that, if you stay with the aerobic processes and you move upstream with your treatment, there is much more opportunity to get something of value. Now, it is a problem of getting that fertilizer into condition, into the shape that people will buy it. And particularly if you go into any anaerobic digestion process, you usually can't do it. And the city of Los Angeles, as I understand it, completely digests their sewage, their sludge that they get out of the sewage, and then put it back in to go out into the ocean. And that's the cheapest way to get rid of it. And that is a practice I don't like. Yes?
Do you see any limit to the population we can accommodate in California? If so, when do we get there?
Question is there any limit to the population we can accommodate, and when will we get to that limit?
I certainly not an expert along that line, and we can certainly accommodate twice as many people here in Southern California. I don't think it'll be as nice as it is now. I've known it all my life. I thought it was best when I was born.
My point is, you don't see a limitation from the water standpoint.
No, you sort of run out of land. That 7.7 billion cubic kilometers would be a long ways off. Yes.
Pillsbury, there was some words of wisdom on the Colorado River Basin development. What about the Sacramento San Joaquin? Is that fully developed, or are there more dams that can be built? That's one question. Two, in your field of water for agriculture, you touched that briefly, but could you give us a little more insight into the contamination that's allowable in potable water and in agricultural water, and why the difference?
Agricultural water is, well, let's see, the first question concerned more storage in the Central Valley. They're sort of running out of most of the best storage sites, most of the potential there. There is still some opportunity to bring water from the northwestern coastal area, the Klamath River in particular. There's some of that area up there that seems to be, like Southern California, a pretty high sediment producer. The Central Valley, the streams drain into there are. And the result is that I think dams in the Central Valley are a lot more valid because they won't be filling up with silt for hundreds of years and maybe 1,000 years. Whereas on the north coastal area, they would tend to fill up with sediment much faster. So I would just as soon see that northwestern country left sort of wild river type. A lot of people won't agree with me, but that's my feeling about it. Just see, your second question was about agriculture. Agriculture does not really pollute water. It primarily concentrates. The evapotranspiration takes off distilled water in effect and leaves more and more. As you have only 1/5 the water left, you have 5 times the concentration you started out with, and that's a typical once over use. Throughout the San Joaquin Valley, water is naturally used over and over again because well water constitutes the biggest source of supply for the valley. The Central Valley of California is pretty well now developed, except for that land on the west side of the San Joaquin Valley, which is coming in under the San Luis Project in Fresno County and under the California Water Plan from there south, Kings and Kern County. Yes?
Are many of the lakes or reservoirs using organic monolayers to cut down evaporation?
Just small reservoirs. The wind blows enough so that usually you can't maintain a film. It has been very disappointing except for very small reservoirs. And it does cause the water to get a little additional heating. They are trying making it more reflectant, so more of the heat energy is reflected to overcome that. We do not seem to be making much progress except in very small reservoirs where maybe you can save 10 or 15%. Yes?
Apparently, the Department of Water and Power doesn't agree with the view about the dam in Colorado. You know what their reasoning is? Why they
I have no concept of what their reasoning is. It's a very good power source. Now, if they want to forget about Hoover Dam, except for flood control, and go to that Bridge Canyon, this is a different name now, I can't think of it, site, there's a narrow gorge there, they would not have this a big evaporative surface. And possibly they could save 500,000 acre-feet a year by substituting that site for Hoover Dam. But it seems to be a rather an expensive undertaking. And unless they specifically had an arrangement where they would, one would take over the repayment cost of the other, I don't think it would work very well, because we still have some years to go to pay off Hoover Dam. We're paying it on schedule, even though we're not getting much now because it has been used almost solely for peaking. The level's down so far, they're using it just for peaking. Yes? It gives you an opportunity to reuse the water, not for domestic purposes. There might be some industrial purposes it could be used for, but basically I was thinking of recreation and fire protection around the periphery of the chaparral lands. Yes?
You used the figure 7.7 representing the ultimate need of Los Angeles. I was wondering two things. One, what year this ultimate need, what you project the year to be? Secondly, what is the population figure you're using?
I've used no figure whatsoever. I've done no estimating of population. I merely said that the State Department of Water Resources has said there is that much land, and at the rate we're using up our land, probably that will be used up. Maybe in 2000 or something like that. I don't know. I've made no attempt to estimate what population will be. I guess that's most of them. Oh, one more.
Is the amount of water that we waste any important factor in the total picture? Is there any evidence in education studies to the larger water?
On a per capita basis, you're using about 150 gallons per day here, roughly. That's a general figure. About 50 of that is for the outside uses, watering the gardens and so forth, parks. About 100 gallons used inside on the average by industry and commerce and domestic. I don't think it's in keeping with our affluent society to talk about being a little stingy on wasting water. I don't think there's a big potential for saving there. We can improve the reuse of the water, but each time it goes through a treatment plant, you have to figure that your parts per million is going up about 300. And that we really are reusing it now and don't know it, because interior, the water they use there is going into the ground and it's being pumped out closer to the coast. Where you have no open rivers, you have a natural reuse of water, and you're using it about to the limit now, except unless you want to develop these peripheral uses that I say, recreation and fire protection, which could use a lower quality water. One more thing. The city of Los Angeles doesn't use much water from the Colorado, but Southern California needs it. The Metropolitan Water District has to get every drop of water they can through that so that nobody will run short of water. Los Angeles has plenty. The rest of Southern California this year is an exception, but it has been that they're pretty well on the borderline. Now, the original entitlement was based on these higher flow rates. Nobody's ever said so, but it's my opinion this decreased flow that the later records show is because of the development, because these greater evaporation surfaces, because the vast areas of phreatophytes, the worthless vegetation, which have been created by raising the water table all the way up through the valley. I think maybe we better close now, hadn't we? It's 9.